Thank you very much for joining us today for the last webinar of our fall of the Adirondack Research Consortium and Paul Smith College Meeting the Demands of Changing Climates webinar. You can see we have some sponsors for the event that we'd like to thank for sponsoring. And I'm going to start with Annie Rochon from Paul Smith College, the Director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, with the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. We would like to acknowledge that Paul Smith College is located on the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous people. This area is a home, workplace, and or classroom for all of us. And it is therefore important that we know its history and acknowledge the long ancestral heritage that is based here. We respect and honor the legacy of the original people of this land and recognize the continued contribution to the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Before I introduce Neil, I would just like to ask for any questions that you have during today's webinar, please put them in the Q&A and we will address them live, or if there's some that we can't get to, we'll put those up on our website. The recording for this and all of the webinars in the series will be available on YouTube shortly after. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Neil Patterson, the Assistant Director for the Center of Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY ESF. Thank you so much, Neil.
Hello. Well, welcome to everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I really appreciate the work that the Research Consortium does. I think the last time I was up there, we were up in Lake Placid, and I learned a lot from this consortium. So I appreciate everyone who's joining today. I'd like to begin by introducing myself in my own language, and this is something your ancestors, or perhaps the first folks who encountered our people, might have heard. So Twant Askanaha. Gata Dequadia, Disna Walknana, Skaruda, Equahala, Gaya Dakra. Ikisasata Dirachox, Disna Wakutna, Agunasiat di Afnoeta Udaya, Disna SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Wagana harata hatwa ekwahewe disna ekwahewe disna ekwa iska harusana yafna wagana harata hatwa rakuwana royana gaya riwaya neri disna gaya guanata wagana harata ana ucha. So I was taught to introduce myself. I've been doing that over Zoom now for a little while, like many of you, but introduce myself in my own language, which is what we call Skarudik Geha, and that's the language of the Tuscarora people. We are a member nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which in our language we call Agunasiantni. And I'd like to share a little bit about the Agunasiantni today and their work in the places where we both live today. I also want to recognize that there might be people who hold titles, and certainly the conference organizers, the leadership of the Adirondack Research Consortium, and others. Want to thank you and honor your work today. So we, in our way, we always make sure to recognize those who hold titles. And to say Yagwajaneti, that I'm happy we are together. In fact, one of the things that we would have done in person is to give thanks to all of creation together. It's something, a process, a protocol that Haudenosaunee people engage in whenever we meet together. It is mandatory for, in our way of putting our minds together to recognize all of the life that supports us. And so that's how we begin our meetings in our communities today. And for thousands of years, this Ganahara Dechra, this opening address, or what people would say, the words that come before all else, are shared among the people so that we can bring our minds together. I'd like to share a little bit about the changing climate of Indigenous land care. Okay, I hope you can see that all. I can't really see folks on the call here. Okay, great. So Melanie's giving me the thumbs up. And if you sort of hadn't already thought about this title, and it's a little bit of a play on words, right? We know today the climate is changing. You all have been meeting about this and thinking about this and using the tools that humans have developed to consider how we respond as a society, as human beings. And so I won't go into the debate that exists in some communities across the world about whether this is happening or whether it's not. But I'd like to really focus on the larger social climate that is occurring across the world, across the planet, in thinking about how Indigenous peoples are the first stewards of land, and about how complex environmental problems like climate change require a diversity of solutions, right? And I think we're finding out about that now at a global level. We're finding that Indigenous peoples, when they take care of land, we find out that the land takes care of us. And you know, it's no secret that much of the world's biodiversity is found in places where Indigenous people have access and tenure to land. And I want folks to think about those two terms in terms of the Adirondacks, right? Access and tenure. And so I want to begin by recognizing that we are a people of the land, that Indigenous people in New York State form their identity from the land. And this is our calendar. And in our way of Thanksgiving, and in our way of protocol, these are the things that we would give thanks for. We are approximately at about 6 o'clock. If this circle were a human clock, so right at the bottom between fall and winter, the way that we move around this circle is in a counterclockwise direction. And so we're moving right into the heart of harvest season. Throughout our communities, and including in my own home, we are focusing on giving thanks for the gifts of the fields and the forests that are given to us. And so I know some of you on this call are going to hop off and be threshing beans, perhaps braiding corn, and probably for many of you, thinking about the gifts of the animals, our animal relatives, right? The gifts of the mammals and birds that provide us sustenance. I know I am. After this call, I will be going directly to the woods. But that practice, the practice of hunting, which is on our minds today, is part of a spiritual cycle of ceremonies for Haudenosaunee people. And eventually we will move into the time of the maple. You see it labeled here as Wata. These are Mohawk words that are displayed here, describing our spiritual cycle, the cycles of nature, in fact. And eventually after maple, we'll start to begin to think about our seeds and about planting. We will focus on the fish, geche, that are in our creeks, in our rivers, and in our lakes. And we'll focus then on the wild berries, in particular, the wild strawberry. It is the leader of the berries. And I encourage you all, if you have not shared within your community, within your families, within your clans, to try that sip of maple sap, the sap that we give thanks for. It is not the sugar or the syrup that we are giving thanks for. We are giving thanks for the return of the sap. And that is central to our cycle of Thanksgiving. Is a central, I suppose, tenet of Haudenosaunee belief systems is that it is our job and our responsibility to give thanks first. In fact, when I sit and listen to our leaders in our community, our chiefs and our clan mothers and our faith keepers, there is no asking in our way of communicating with each other and with the natural world. There are no requests. And in fact, a large part of our teachings are rooted in the faith that these gifts will return. And so it's our duty to give thanks first. So I want to acknowledge that at the beginning of this presentation, that humans are really one of the only species and life forces on Mother Earth that are helpless, that require the gifts of nature to survive. Susan Hill wrote a book a few years ago, and I wanted to include this quote, really to solidify the connection between Indigenous people, and specifically Haudenosaunee people, and land, right? And she says that our land and territory are the prime determinants of our identity. And so what does that mean? If we think about land being our identity, right? I'm sure many of you on this call today have all kinds of necklaces, as we would say, or all kinds of titles, you might say, that you're wearing. You are scientists, you are perhaps politicians, perhaps you are landowners, perhaps you work in a university setting, as do I. But for Haudenosaunee people, the identity comes from the land. It doesn't exist as an artifact of human creation, of the tools that we've made. And so if we think about what that means, we think about our return to the land, right? And this is a program that has allowed me to explore what that means with our young people. We were fortunately funded and have a really strong partner in the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, where one of our main goals is to establish relationships with place. We've been thankful for the support of donors, of agencies like the National Science Foundation, to continue to maintain the link between our young people and the land. And so a lot of what I'm going to share today comes from that work, the work of the center in outreach and education with communities. And I would just share a story about that. You know, I had never really been to the Adirondacks as a child, except for a very rare case when my dad would pile us into the car and he would say, "Let's go see Ray Fadden." If you don't know, Ray Fadden was a powerful ally of the Haudenosaunee people, working throughout his life in the 40s and 50s and 60s, right up until the late 70s and 80s, in doing this kind of work, in bringing Indigenous youth to their Aboriginal territories, to their traditional lands. And it's the first time I saw a black bear, which was significant for me, coming from a family of the Bear Clan. The Ratchhawks is what is my identity as a Haudenosaunee people. And so when we think about our identity, right, even our clans, they are animals of places. And so it's very significant for me to see these bears up in Onchioda, New York, where the Six Nations Indian Museum is today. And I think it was inspiring. It was a formative experience for me to travel to the Adirondacks and to see land that was in a different state than the land that I grew up on in Western New York. And so I just wanted to say that has always inspired my work with youth in our communities. And I have a special place in my heart for the Adirondack area. We continue our cultural practices, right? This is what many folks are talking about when we say land-based learning, right? In all of our Haudenosaunee communities, this idea of gathering plants, as you see here, exuberant group, harvesting sweetgrass from the Adirondack Park. It's a cultural practice that is thousands of years old, right? And it comes from the land. And so this idea of land-based learning also helps form our identity as Haudenosaunee people. Our identity, though, is of course a much larger one that's shared with other Indigenous people. And that's important when we think about Adalunda, right? The porcupine, or what people call the Adirondack Park. The park is situated in a central location of a nation that we would call the Maple Nation, right? And so many of us consider ourselves as well, not only citizens or members of a specific clan or a nation, which in themselves, if we think about Ganyakahaga, right, about the Mohawk people, this is about the place of the flint, the people of the flint. That is a land-based identity. But we also share this with other Indigenous people, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Abenaki people, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Cree, and we all collectively are part of something that we would call Maple Nation. And so we have these particular trees, these particular animals, these particular fish or plants that are known as cultural keystone species, right? And for Haudenosaunee people, it's very specific in our opening address. Something that I would share with you is to say, Wakayat naraku uchigata akadachi, which means that they chose, the people chose the maple tree, the sugar maple, uchigata, very specific species, as our leader. And so it's a leader among the trees for Haudenosaunee people. And I can't underscore enough the impact that climate change is predicted to have on this cultural keystone species for all of Maple Nation, reaching all the way to Minnesota, down into the Smoky Mountains, up into Maine, and thinking about the shifting range under this particular global climate model here from the IPCC. When we look at the range in blue and we think about the scenarios in terms of our carbon emissions, we find refugia, which is something that Indigenous people are very familiar with. If you think about the history of colonialism, the Maple Nation lies within and beyond and adjacent to Haudenosaunee lands. And I like this map. It's produced by our own people in thinking about the kinds of relationships we have with land. The notion of a deed or title, or for that matter, a survey instrument, is not found in our worldview. This notion that that's yours and this is mine doesn't really exist. And I think these categories of land, these buffer lands, these allied lands, and for me, being Tuscarora, extending down into what's today called North Carolina, adjacent to the primary lands, right? And we think about primary lands, about perhaps more of a direct connection to the land in terms of those spiritual cycle of ceremonies. This is a much better way of thinking about our relationship with land, not our territory. This is why, for many of us in Haudenosaunee country, the notion of a land acknowledgement to say, this is a specific people's land, is a bit perplexing to many of us. We have our own process for acknowledging each other on the land. And it involves a process that has been shared among the Haudenosaunee and all Indigenous people who we've encountered for thousands of years. And let me just share that briefly with you, because a lot of people don't know what the process was for engagement and what settlers have been doing for hundreds of years in Haudenosaunee country. And if you think about the land as shaping this acknowledgement, I guess if you want to call it an acknowledgement, it is the duty of each other to recognize each other and go through a process of bringing our minds up And we call that, some folks call it a ceremony. I call it more of a protocol of the 3 bare words and the edge of the woods. And so imagine that you are walking through the Adirondacks and you approach a clearing. It was your job as somebody who was not living in that space, somebody who was maybe not always hunting or fishing in that space, to build a small fire. And you would build that fire at the edge of the woods, and you would send the smoke up as a signal to say, there is an opportunity to greet each other here. And the people from the clearing, which is sort of always this 2 sides to the balance of natural world, the forest and the clearing, would approach the people at the edge of the woods. And we would go through a very ritualistic exercise of recognizing the loss, the hurt, the pain, the sadness perhaps that folks are bringing in with them. Because it's an arduous journey, right? Some of you had that arduous journey today in trying to find the right Zoom link like I did. Of course, folks at ARC were great about that. Some of you might have had trouble with your computers or the dog barking in the background. And so we have all experienced this arduous journey to a clearing, right? A place where we can meet and raise our minds up together. That is the acknowledgement of land that Haudenosaunee people have been engaged in these places for thousands of years. And we would call those original instructions. So when people meet together, the question is, how do we share the land? How do we, as Haudenosaunee people say, share this dish, right? And what I would say to you today, that this wampum belt, which is thousands of years old and still held in our communities today, is the first natural resource policy of the Haudenosaunee, and perhaps one of the first agreements that Indigenous people had with each other prior to settlers, prior to the colonial exploit of this land. And what the people agreed to is that all of the natural resources, whether it's the Adirondack natural resources, or whether it's New York State natural resources, or whether it's the resources of Turtle Island, are inside of this dish. And the way in which people, human beings, interact with that dish is through one spoon. And the wampum belt, when people talk about it, they remind ourselves that it is our responsibility to make sure everyone is fed at that dish with one spoon. And the use of a fork or a knife is prohibited. This notion of private property certainly was foreign. If we think about people operating under this kind of worldview about the natural world. The beaver is there, often used as a metaphor, because the tail of the beaver is what the people say is inside of that dish, right? And so the tail of the beaver is a real important representation of Haudenosaunee winter food, food that people used to survive over the time when we were not harvesting and we did not have our plant relatives providing a lot of our nutrients. And I can tell you from experience that eating the tail of a beaver with one spoon among shared friends and family is an intimate experience. It's an experience where we get to know each other, as opposed to let's cut serving size pieces up and hand them out. This is a model of equity, not equality. The last thing I'll point out of thinking about climate change and its impact on Indigenous peoples and our care for the land is the long timeline, right? And so we've talked a little bit about the space of Indigenous land care. We've talked a little bit about our law, our natural resource policy of thinking about the land. But let's recognize the long game here. When Haudenosaunee people returned to the Adirondacks 13,000 years ago, right? The return of our plant relatives, the relationship that people have built up with these plants over this timeline, including our food plants, like Gachetwath, or squash, or Ganahagera, our maize, our corn relatives. And so when we think about climate change in this context, we think about it as another wave, right? And it's really an extension of, for many Indigenous communities, the colonial experiment, right? The experiment to dominate another place with an extractive worldview. And so 20 years ago, when I was just getting involved in environmental issues, there were so many scientists and so many people from Western knowledge systems who were approaching our communities saying, what are you going to do about climate change? I think many of us were like, yeah, that's important. We need to keep it in the ground, right? We need to sequester. We need to support reduction of carbon pollution into the atmosphere. Those are primary realizations, but that realization and that approach, that sort of approach to mitigating or adapting to climate change was really another chapter in the colonial experiment for Indigenous people. And for many communities, it was not a primary interest to be working with Western science on how we are going to adapt and what is our climate change plan for the future. And Kyle White, who is a Potawatomi author, has written some very interesting papers on this very subject about the dystopia that climate change presents and often leaves Indigenous people out of. And I encourage you to explore those readings. We certainly don't have time today to sort of unpack a larger Indigenous worldview of climate change. But it's safe to be said that Indigenous people are experts at adaptation, right? And I think a lot of times that's why we hear these messages of we are still here. That's pretty significant. So how do we respond? Because isn't climate change really just collateral damage from the colonial experiment? And if we accept the fact that the colonial experiment is in itself producing climate change, how do we seek justice for human beings and our relatives in the natural world, right? I think there is so much interest today in thinking about the personhood and the standing of sugar maple, of the St. Regis River, of the Saranac Lakes, right? The notion that these elements of creation all were given their own specific duties, and it is our job to make sure that those parts of creation can continue to fulfill their duties. And so I'd like to use this graphic that we created for a gathering that we had a few years ago at the Blue Mountain Center, in thinking about how we use the North Star of justice to create our spoons, right, at this dish. What is in our spoons? When we think about our spoons as both metaphorically drawing from the dish, of utilizing the natural world to support our life, but also what are the spoons that we have to put back into the dish, right? That's also part of the teaching. How do we ensure that there's a continued meal of beaver tail in that dish? And so what is in our spoons? What do we have to give, keeping the North Star of justice as our beacon, as our goal, as our center of restorative acts, right? And so I'd like to move through this quickly with you all, because I think it's a very useful metaphor about the work that you're doing as research scientists, right? You probably can picture yourself somewhere in this constellation. You all certainly are thinking about issues about planning. We are all learning together. But let's begin first by thinking about remembering. And remembering that this is a place that the Adirondack Park in New York State today is a site where one of the most dramatic losses of land has occurred under the colonial experiment, right? We did some back of the envelope calculations a few years ago with Rick Hill over in Six Nations. And we figured out that Haudenosaunee people today occupy about 0.00023% of their original territories. And so this historic loss of access and tenure to our traditional territories must be recognized. It must be remembered if we are to move towards restorative justice and towards a complex solution to a complex environmental problem like climate change. We also have to remember that along with this land dispossession throughout Indian country in North America, that there was also a dispossession of our lifeways, of our cultural lifeways. My grandmother was a boarding school survivor, and there were boarding schools all throughout New York State and Lower Canada where Haudenosaunee people who had relationship with Saranac Lakes, with the St. Regis River, were sent to these institutions to erase that relationship, to erase the language of that land that I shared with you earlier today. And so we also have to remember that if we're thinking about working with Indigenous communities, that this is part of their history, but it's also part of American history. It's part of New York State history, just like those oaks and those maples that returned home to Haudenosaunee lands. This is what happened to our relatives. We have to remember that public lands are ancestral lands. And we'll get a little bit more into that in depth in a few slides. So it's interesting when we think about the notion of the public, right? Which seems to be front and center, certainly for regulators, for policymakers, some of the folks that you all are working to feed information to, right? We have to remember that the Adirondack Park is Indian land. And agreements have been made over those lands. And I will repeat what I have found recently to be a very useful concept. When we think about treaties that happened, that affected and pertain to, and our law that governs these lands, including the Adirondack Park, we have to think about the treaties. We have to think about the original agreements that were made between settlers and Indigenous people that are still valid agreements today and are still honored today and are still upheld by our leadership. And so, to quote Oren Lyons, who is a faith keeper from the Onondaga Nation that I've been so fortunate to be around for many years and to learn from, he reminds everyone all the time that these are not Indian treaties. These are treaties for people living in these places, and that includes non-Indigenous people as well. And so when we think about your work in upstate New York, we have to remind ourselves that all people in New York State are treaty people. All people are treaty people. That there were these agreements that were made about how we are going to live together and share that dish. That's at the heart of many of these agreements. And today, in reestablishing and revitalizing our relationship with places like the Adirondack Park, I'm always sure to carry a list of these treaties in my pocket to remind folks who work in these places that there are original agreements about how Indigenous people use, access, and care for places like the Adirondack Park. And it has been a long road to remember that treaties are not a special treatment, and that reserved rights that Indigenous people have for places like the Five Ponds Wilderness, like the Tug Hill Plateau, are not special treatment for an ethnic minority. They are agreements between sovereign entities. And so often the approach has been to say, well, Neil, show me where you can hunt in the Five Ponds Wilderness under this treaty. And it begins a long road of education, right? A long road of learning together about the agreements of this land. And the notion that there are specific rights that were not mentioned in treaties. And quite often, the free use and enjoyment, the phrase that we find in the 1794 treaty that was created at Canandaigua, is such a large concept that it's part of something called reserved rights, right? Rights that were reserved by Indigenous peoples that were not recognized or signed away in a specific agreement. And I think that's a really interesting window into the Indigenous worldview of land, right? Free use and enjoyment. It's a term that I've often pondered and thought, why did my ancestors sort of think about their relationship with land, and the protection that they sought was focused around free use and enjoyment? I encourage you to think about that. I'm sure many of you are thinking about that in creating management plans for public use, right? So after we remember together, after we move towards this, the pocket of the spoon which holds all of our work together, we encourage you all to think about a vision, right? A vision of restorative justice, a vision of land rematriation, of thinking about co-management as an act of restorative justice, right? And we see a little bit of that happening around Haudenosaunee territory. We see examples where families have decided together, we are going to move down this restorative path and recognize the first stewards of this land, and recognize that often deed and title may or may not be part of that restoration, but the free use and enjoyment, right? The tenure and access that Indigenous people have with our traditional territories. And it's been a really exciting experience. This is a picture that I took back in, I think it was probably 2009, 2008. It was one of our first trips to the Adirondack Park, where I took folks from all across Haudenosaunee reservations. And this is a picture, I believe it's on the Moose River. You can see sort of a suspension bridge hanging over the river. And it's just been such a really, I'm so grateful for the experience of being there when Indigenous youth experience place, perhaps not that unlike that moment when humans returned, right? 13,000 years ago. I often wonder, are these the scenes? Are these the smiles? Are these the ambivalence at times? Is this the struggle that you would see on Indigenous youth thousands of years ago being recreated today, being embodied in our youth today? Because it's not all fun and happy times in these experiences, but they are ancestral experiences. When we move down this constellation to think about collaboration, so many of you are thinking, well, perhaps how might I do this in our work? How might I restore justice to the lands where I'm working? How might I recognize Indigenous land tenure and access? We think about collaboration, right? Collaboration with community. One of the most, uplifting stories I can think of lately in some of the places where you all work has been the Hogansburg Dam removal, which was a very, just a wonderful, wonderful act that Kanien'kehá:ka people got behind years ago. It was years ago, I was in discussions with the Mohawk people at Akwesasne about this dam that existed on their territory. and has become not only an act of restoration, but an act of collaboration, right? Working with all kinds of federal agencies like the Energy Regulatory Commission, a little bit with the New York State DEC, US Fish and Wildlife Service, to open up 555 miles of historic habitat on the St. Regis River. It is the first instance where an Indian nation has removed a dam, and it is the first decommission and removal of a dam in New York State. And to think about what this actually means when we think about collaboration together in working to restore habitat, we then start to see that spoon begin to fill up, right? That collective gratitude and collective action together, collaborating on this dam removal as an act of restoring environment, but also as an act of restoring culture. And thinking about anadromous fish who now have access to places that they didn't before is a very interesting analogy in a lot of ways when we think about Indigenous land tenure and access. We have to remember that there are guidelines for working and collaborating with Indigenous people. Many of those are found in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And to just say that many of the leaders that you might work with today in our communities were at the table when this declaration was first being dreamt about, was first being visioned, right? People had a vision about what are the rights of Indigenous people to our territories. And you can find lots of important, very succinct and straightforward acts of restorative justice that you all can be part of in the places that you work. It also lays out a guideline of what we think about in our communities today about consultation, about consent, and about how this consent has to be based on a model of being free, prior, and informed. And I just wanted to mention this, that some of you are all thinking, I don't even know where to start in thinking about how to enact Indigenous land care in the places that I work. And I encourage you, there are lots of resources about this idea of free, prior, and informed. And so reach out at the earliest conception of your idea of managing land, right? Your idea of how land works in your own systems. We learn together, right? And this is a photo of a project that the center's been working hard on here at ESF in educating conservation officers, recruits who attend the law enforcement academy run by the New York State DEC, and reminding them that they are treaty people as well, reminding them of free use and enjoyment, and reminding them that public lands are ancestral lands. And we learn together, right? We learn about the way that the DEC manages land, the way that the Adirondack Park Agency manages land, the way that private landowners manage land. This is a learning and sharing experience together. Ultimately, what do we imagine for our future, right? What do we imagine together? And for me, this is where my imagination goes to. It is to a day and a time where my family, pictured here, has that free use and enjoyment, right? That tenure and access to gather wild strawberries, to be part of that spiritual cycle of life of this land, right? of gathering roots, of gathering berries, gathering fish. And so Indigenous communities have a vision. They have a vision for the places that you work. And we need to envision that together. We need to imagine what is possible. And then we need to plan, right? So how do we do this? And many of you want to sort of, I feel at times folks want to skip right to the planning, like, okay, how do we get this done in the places that I work? Several projects that the center is working on are focused around how does this occur in other spaces across Turtle Island? How has land justice and land restitution happened with respect to transfers, co-management, cultural easements, which by the way are such a beautiful companion and twin in a way to conservation easements. And we're finding out some really great tools about how those work together for biocultural restoration, right? And this cultural restoration that people in our communities have a vision and can imagine also requires telling a little bit different story of land, right? And this is a term Gary Nabham coined a few years ago, is that we're interested in restoration. What is the story of our relationship with land, of Indigenous relationship with land? It's something that I think about every time I travel to the Adirondacks on my way to Onchiota, and the signage that I see, the stories that are told about the Adirondack Park, about the 46 peaks over 4,000 feet, right? There are a lot of stories that are in sort of the public thought about that place that could use a little polishing. It could use perhaps a little bit different perspective of that long history of place. Some of the work that we're doing also includes working with communities to know what's in these places that they have not maybe visited in a long time by doing bioblitzes. And so if we think about how we began and thinking about our process of acknowledging each other, of recognizing each other at the edge of the woods, land acknowledgements can be a powerful force in that. The restoration and the renaming, right? And this comes up all the time with Adalunda, the Mohawk word for porcupine, right? Adalunda. It also is a process where we need to recognize that each of those lakes, each of those rivers, each of those sugar maples have their own responsibilities. And it's our job to recognize a more kin-centric ecological future, right? About family. And this is why we talk about the natural world as family. Once we recognize each other over that smoke, over that fire that's built at the edge of the woods, we then begin to build trust, right? We begin to collaborate. We begin to, what we say, polish the chain in a Haudenosaunee way of thinking, the chain that tethers us together on this river of life. We think about traditional ecological knowledge as the twin to the scientific ecological knowledge that you all are engaged in. We think about the advocacy that can happen when land banks and land trusts say, we're going to work and collaborate with you on your vision and our imagined world together, right? The advocacy piece, the trust that we have allies that recognize Indigenous land tenure and access. And finally, we see a world of healing, right? Ultimately, this is, you might say, the icing on the cake if we seek this restorative justice, if we seek to decolonize conservation, we find healing in sharing the land. We find these agreements that work together for culture and environment. And in some cases, the rematriation, the return of land to women, which is really a significant way of thinking in Haudenosaunee culture. The land provides, she is the giver of life. A quick shot of the work that is involved in these BioBlitzes. And I just wanted to share, you know, we did a BioBlitz up in that St. Regis watershed, not far from Meacham Lake, where we worked with each other to provide communities with information about the land, about the biological relatives that are in those places that are seeking this justice. And it was a very important experience for me because I learned a lot of history from the Mohawk people in that place, and a history of justice work in the Adirondack Park as well. Finally, I would posit to you today that when Indigenous land tenure and access is restored, we see benefits for the environment, right? We began by talking about complex environmental problems require complex environmental solutions and a diversity of approaches. And when we look at, as we know from the United Nations research, when Indigenous stewardship or care for the land takes place, we see benefits to the land. We see enhanced protection, enhanced restoration. And this is a study that certainly can make available. I would encourage you to think about looking this up, called First Stewards, by one of our colleagues, Nick Rio at Dartmouth College, that actually measured, in this case, the regeneration of forests that occurred on the Lac du Flamme and the Menominee Forest in comparison to surrounding national forests and public lands that were not under the care of Indigenous people, and showed a dramatic difference, a statistically significant difference in both the diversity and the abundance of our plant relatives in those places where Indigenous care was implemented and made part of management plans. I'll leave you with this quote, you know, which to me encapsulates not only climate change and how Indigenous people are responding to climate change, but also to the notion of what governs Indigenous land care, right? What is some of the central operating principles that go beyond cultural easements, or go beyond rematriation, or where these ideas are nested, and they're nested in the cycles of nature. Dr. John Mohawk, who was a Seneca man that I met when I was young, he said that our sense of natural law is that nature informs us, and it's our obligation to read nature like you would a poem, to be part of that and step into its cycles as much as you can. And so I want to say that, I appreciate the work that you all are doing to step into those cycles. And I think the work you're doing is so inspiring, but also it lends itself to this kind of caretaking, right? This approach to Indigenous land care. And so I'll end it there. I'm not even sure if I went over time here or what, but happy to take questions and comments.
Neil, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. We were a little bit over. We only had one question, so I'll send that to you and we can post an answer to that on the ARC website. I put the link in chat. The recording for this will be up later today. Thank you so much. That was the perfect way to end our fall webinar series. So make sure to check out the chat where everyone is thanking you for your time and your beautiful words. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we will see you in the spring. Bye-bye.
Bye.